What we've dealt with in AIDS is a 25-year experiment in the social construction of reality. The HIV/AIDS model is internally consistent. If you don't know anything about any of the other possibilities, and if you don't know how little actual science is behind it, it makes a good deal of sense. It explains the world. It's like any religious myth or creation myth. Its function is to explain the world, to rationalize the world, to make sense out of events that have baffled people, like in the gay community, the fact that in the early 1980s, a lot of people, particularly especially prominent people in the gay community, suddenly started getting sick in unusual ways, and many of them died quite quickly. That was a very scary reality, and the people who took over the so-called war on AIDS, the virologists who'd spent 10 years trying and failing to find a viral cause of cancer, grabbed onto AIDS, took it over, and blamed AIDS on the same kind of virus that they had blamed cancer on. So, and at the same time, they had the political clout to turn off and actively suppress research into any other possibility of what AIDS might be. So the traditional mechanisms by which science avoids big mistakes like this were short-circuited. They were turned off. So that was how you have this very bizarre situation where hundreds of millions of people in the US and around the world believe something that, if you actually look at it logically, go into it de novo, can detach from the emotions, can just look rationally and say, prove it. If you can do that, then the risk hypothesis of AIDS makes a lot more sense than the HIV hypothesis of AIDS. And then your worldview totally changes. It's like coming back out of the looking glass, where Lewis Carroll one of Lewis Carroll's characters says that she always tries to believe at least 6 impossible things before breakfast. Well, in order to believe that HIV causes AIDS, you have to believe far more than 6 impossible things all day. But because it's been surrounded from day one with so much emotion, so much fear, so much psychology, so much drama, very few people are capable of looking at AIDS logically. The emotions are in play. You know, all of our attitudes towards sex and sexuality are in play. How we define ourselves, you know, as sexual beings, gay, straight, bi, whatever. How we define ourselves as human beings, what our role in is the world. What our role in is the world. You know, all of these things are affected by the AIDS myth. And to suddenly step back out of the AIDS myth and look at this thing realistically, to pass out of the looking glass world of HIV and AIDS into things that can be documented, things that can be proven, a world where viruses behave according to the rules 150 years of microbiology said they did, and not the rules as they've been rewritten to accommodate HIV as the cause of AIDS. It's an immensely liberating experience, but it also cuts you off from a lot of social support. You know, it can make you, if you live in the gay community as I do, as a gay man, a gay activist, a gay publisher, writer, it can make you very unpopular in certain circles. It can make people feel like you're literally killing their friends, simply because you say, wait a minute, this isn't logical. This doesn't make sense. Now, what these other guys are saying does make sense. So, if there's one message I hope the people watching this get, it is get out of the emotion. Look at the logic. Look only at hard facts. Look at what can be proven. Look at the realm that scientists are supposed to be in. Kary Mullis tells this marvelous story of someone coming up to him after one of his talks and saying, "You don't believe HIV causes AIDS?" To which Mullis replied, You and I are scientists. We're not supposed to believe anything. That is what religion is about. That is what faith is about. Scientists are supposed to observe, experiment, and reason from what they observe. They're not supposed to grab hold of an idea and cling to it and adjust everything else in their perceptions to fit that idea. That's what religion does. That's why I call HIV/AIDS faith-based science. That you see, for example, I've gotten into many arguments with people who will point to one individual and say, well, he didn't use drugs. I don't know if he didn't use drugs or not. Often the people I'm talking to don't know if he used drugs or not. They'll run down the whole list of risk factors and claim he didn't do any of them. He got AIDS, therefore it must be HIV. And this is exactly how the intelligent design people argue, going through the fossil records, and whenever there's a gap in the fossil record, they see, this is where God stepped in. This is where the intelligent design happened. It's like, a lot of these people who oppose creationism, say that they're for science, don't realize how in buying into HIV as the cause of AIDS, they're playing the same game as the creationists. I remember one HEAL meeting where one guy came in and said, you guys don't believe in evolution. And then later on in the meeting, I used the phrase natural selection. And the same person looked at me and said, natural selection, what does that mean? I said, it's the essence of the theory of evolution. If you're going to defend the theory of evolution, you ought to at least know what it is. So, AIDS is believing in HIV as the cause of AIDS is a belief. It's based on emotion. It's based on authority. I believe it because the people in the white lab coats say so. It is not based on logic. And I believe that anybody who looks at the evidence for and against both ideas of what AIDS is will come to the conclusion, if they can do so logically, forget the emotion, forget the propaganda, just look at the facts and the laws of biology and how microbes do and don't cause disease. Anybody who does that, I think, anybody who does that perfectly fairly will come to the conclusion that AIDS cannot be an infectious disease. It cannot be caused by HIV or any other single virus or microbe. And we've been lied to for a very long time by people who have told us it is. What was called the fast lane lifestyle really began as a result of the onset of the gay liberation movement in 1969. It was really a very heady time for queer folk everywhere, that they were suddenly discovering their sexuality, their connections. They had started this new and powerful movement that was saying, don't be ashamed of yourselves, be proud of yourselves, be proud of who you are. That the real reason that the Stonewall riots broke the gay movement open the way they did was, before that, in the 1960s, there had been a gay movement, but it had been obsessed with the idea that gays were psychologically sick, and it was framed much the way the disability rights movement has been framed since, that it was, that even though these people are sick and perverted, they should, or at least these people were sick, they should be treated decently, they shouldn't be discriminated against because it's a sickness, they have no control over it. What changed in 1969, largely as a result of the fact that this was the height of the counterculture movement of the 1960s in general, that gays became part of that, that they rejected the idea that they were sick and grabbed onto their power. Now, in that, they still faced an enormous degree of opposition from the establishment. It was still legal to discriminate against people on the basis of being gay. In all but a handful of states, it was still illegal to have gay sex. But I think the one thing that a lot of people seized on was to explore their sexuality, because that was the one thing that they could do. They didn't have to lobby for it. They didn't have to ask permission. They didn't have to depend on winning something in the legislature or getting exposure in the media. Sex was something they could explore themselves. You had a real explosion in sexuality. You had a lot of gays tying themselves into the feminist critique of the family and saying, you know, we don't want the family model. We are different. Our sexuality is different. Our expression is different. We are not just like straight people, except that we happen to love folks of our own gender. And so you had a vast expansion in the opportunities for casual sex. You had bathhouses. You had many more bars. You had a much lower degree of harassment from the police as more people became aware of the gay movement, and it became a civil rights cause for non-gays as well. The kind of harassment that had created the Stonewall riot in the first place tended to diminish, so gay people could meet each other more easily. They could have sex more easily. They could have sex with a lot more people, and also, this being the 1960s, they had access to a lot more recreational drugs than had been previously available. Okay, you have the burgeoning of a gay liberation movement, and there are a lot of things goals that it had that required the permission of society. They had to get approval from politicians, they had to do lobbying work, they had to do organizing. But one thing that our community could do without having to wait for that was explore our own sexuality. And gay liberation occurs in 1969. It comes right at the tail end of the sexual liberation movement, right at the tail end of the counterculture, the hippie movement, right at the tail end of the drug culture, and also right at the tail end of a very intense period of left-wing radicalism in society. So all of those things are pushing it towards a definition of individual liberation, and liberation, since we are defined by our sexuality, through our sexuality. And as a result, it became a lot easier for gay men to meet each other, to have sex in more casual settings, to have sex with more different partners. And because a lot of gay men bought into the feminist critique of marriage and the family, instead of building the movement towards establishing stable relationships and, living as couples, the movement was in a very different direction, towards liberation, towards casual sex, towards seeing sex with as many different people and on all different points of the continuum between romance and just getting your rocks off as itself part of the liberation. The fact that you started seeing the first AIDS cases about a decade after the gay liberation movement started is itself a clue that it is a toxic disease rather than an infectious one, because that in general is the latency period between the time you start doing something toxic and the time the health consequences start kicking in. It's, for example, 10 years is about the time between the time people start smoking and they experience the first health-related consequences of smoking. And I generally prefer the term toxic rather than lifestyle, but it is, one of the ironies in all of this is that Peter Duesberg said that if he's right, only about 2% of the entire gay male population was ever at risk for AIDS. According to the viral AIDS hypothesis, 100% of the gay male population is at risk for AIDS. Now, why a theory that says 2% of the population is at risk is considered an assault on the gay community, and one that says 100% is considered gay-friendly is beyond me. A lot of people had an investment in that particular lifestyle not just the sex, but the overall partying and the drugs that went with it. And they didn't want to hear that the drugs were part of the condition, that they were the cause of the syndrome. AIDS is a chronic, long-term breakdown of the immune system that can be caused by multiple factors, generally more than one of them operating within any particular person with AIDS or with what has been described as AIDS. And at the top of that in the West would be recreational drug use, also pharmaceutical drug use, repeated infections, including infections with diseases that are genuinely sexually transmitted, repeated antibiotic treatments for these, a lifestyle that involves a lot of partying, lack of nutrition, and in the less developed world, AIDS is primarily a disease of malnutrition, starvation, and the endemic infections that have been part of those environments for years.
Did the fast-track lifestyle exist prior to the 1970s in the gay community?
Did the fast lane lifestyle exist before the 1970s? It might have in a very small handful of people. The problem was, before the advent of gay liberation, gays were so repressed that you didn't have the kind of critical mass for this to really affect a large number of people. It was very difficult for gays to meet. If they tried to cruise each other outdoors, they risked arrest. If they went to a gay bar, they risked arrest. They risked the place being raided and plenty of people pulled in. They also risked having their names given by the police to the media and published. It was quite common for gays who were arrested in these raids to commit suicide afterwards because their secret had finally been exposed. And so you really didn't have the opportunity for so many people to be doing this that it created the kind of critical mass that you had in the 1970s. There are interesting clues that something like AIDS might have been operating. Beverly Sills, in one of her memoirs, says that she knew a lot of gay men in the 1940s and 1950s who were dying of unusual diseases, and she felt that what we now know as AIDS actually started back then.
How did poppers come into the picture?
Poppers are amyl and butyl nitrite inhalants. Their original purpose medically is as an emergency treatment for heart disease. That the idea was you broke one open under a person's nose right when he was about to go into a heart attack, and that dilated his blood vessels and got more blood flowing to his heart so he didn't have the heart attack. That's the medical function of poppers, and sometime in the early 70s, I'm not sure exactly when, gay men discovered poppers, and they had essentially two effects. Number one, they made receptive anal intercourse less painful by dilating those muscles. And they also created a psychological rush. In fact, Rush was the name of one of the major poppers brands that was out there. And it's something I've never experienced personally. I've had a couple of sex partners who use them, and to the extent that I smell them, it just gave me a headache. But from the people who got into poppers and made them part of their lifestyle, the phrase John Reshe uses in his book, The Sexual Outlaw, is whenever anybody uses poppers in his book, he writes, "The room exploded in sex." And that's probably the best description anybody's written about the psychological effect, added to the medical effect facilitating anal sex. There were stories about people going into dance clubs with tremendous amounts of drugs on their person. They were literally wearing poppers around their necks so that anytime they wanted one, they just lifted the bottle and they would carry rags soaked in various chemical substances, including toluene, which is the active psychotropic ingredient of model airplane glue, and Special K, which was an animal tranquilizer, and of course the less esoteric drugs like crystal methamphetamine and cocaine. So, in fact, one of the questions I often get asked is, if recreational drugs were a major cause of AIDS, why didn't more straight people get it? And the answer, I think, is straight people didn't use as many drugs, and probably more importantly, straight people didn't use as many different kinds of drugs at once. That when you take a drug and then you take another drug on top of it, the two drugs interact chemically in your body. And when you add more drugs, you create the potential for more toxic reactions. So the combined effect of everything you're doing is much greater than the effect of each drug individually put together. The medical term for this is called polypharmacy, and it's actually what killed Elvis Presley. That he had developed tolerances for the various drugs that he took, but on the night he died, he took so many of them all at once, they combined in his body into a lethal form.
Were there any warnings in the medical literature prior to 1981 about the potential dangers of poppers?
Absolutely. In fact, in the 1970s, I remember reading articles in the San Francisco Chronicle, particularly warning gay people about the dangers of poppers. I was quite young. I wasn't out yet. This was the first time I ever heard of poppers being used sexually. In fact, I think it was the first time I heard of them at all. That there were, major front page articles in the San Francisco Chronicle serving a city famous for having a large gay community, saying, wait a minute, these things are highly dangerous. They, had certain medical uses. They were an emergency drug. They weren't designed to be used every night, and they could do serious damage to your body. For a while in the 1970s, the main financial supports of the gay press were bar ads and popper ads. That if you were a gay publisher in the 70s and you got a contract from enough of the national poppers makers, you could keep your paper in business. That, it was in that era what the 976 phone sex lines were in the 1980s and what AIDS drugs had been in the 1990s. The big national account that you wanted for your gay paper in order to have a stable revenue stream and stay in business. All the original 5 gay men that Michael Gottlieb described in his report were all living the fast lane lifestyle. They all had multiple sexual partners. They took a lot of different drugs. They did the parties. They did the whole scene. And because they had a lot of sexual partners, they all had long histories of sexually transmitted disease. They'd all been treated for them. And I think it was that, more than anything else, that created the false clue that led people to believe that AIDS itself was an STD, simply because these people had a history of STDs. And both multiple STD infections and the antibiotic treatments for them are major risk factors for AIDS, according to the risk AIDS model. The Centers for Disease Control is in the business of finding and fighting infectious disease. That it's sort of like, you have an arson investigator in the fire department. He's going to want the fire to turn out to be arson, so he has something to do, so he has a reason to feel important. So he has a reason to be in charge of the investigation. He's going to be somewhat disappointed if the fire turns out to be, an electrical wire went haywire or, some other cause. So the CDC wants everything to be an infectious disease because that gives them power, that gives them influence, that gives them things to do, and that gives them an excuse to ask for more money. Just like they did in the case of Legionnaire's disease, which was supposed to be the big hot epidemic of the 1970s and turned out to be a handful of old people getting sick from a fungus spread by an air conditioner in a badly maintained hotel. So, you know, another one of these things where we have this pattern again and again and again. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, you had tremendous scientific inquiries to find the infectious cause of scurvy, the infectious cause of pellagra, the infectious cause of beriberi, all of which turned out to be vitamin deficiencies. In the 1970s, you had swine flu, and right now you have the so-called bird flu epidemic, which quite likely is going to turn out to be pretty much the same thing. A number of people got deathly ill from poultry being raised under extraordinarily unhealthy conditions, and all of a sudden the world is supposed to be scared that there's going to be an enormous viral pandemic that is going to wipe out a large part of the world's population. In the early 70s, there was a joke that the love that dare not speak its name had become the lifestyle that couldn't shut up. And, you saw the backlash as early as 1977 with Anita Bryant and her campaign in Miami to repeal the Miami gay rights law, which succeeded. And in fact, virtually every time that gay rights have been up for a vote, they have been voted down. So, it is clear that we are still a long way from any kind of positive acceptance from a majority of America's straight population. And given the chance to vote up or down on us, they usually vote down. But we certainly became much more visible in the 1970s. It was the visibility that fueled the backlash and created this sense that, perhaps gays were going to pose some kind of danger to the overall population. It really wasn't clear what. There were a lot of people who would have looked at Anita Bryant's campaign, which she called Save Our Children, and wondered, just what on earth are a bunch of adult gay men who are doing things with other adult gay men? How is that going to threaten our children? And, I would say that AIDS played right into that kind of fear. It became the thing that straight America could be afraid of gay America about and have at least a quasi-logical justification for it. Say, oh yes, that's what they're going to do. They're going to spread this horrible disease, and we're going to catch it from prostitutes or bisexuals or whoever, and millions of people are going to die, and it will be the gays who started it. Do I think AIDS brought sympathy to the gay community? In a way it did, and that really surprised me. What began to happen was, first of all, we looked a good deal less dangerous. That, obviously if the main activity of our community was going to be taking care of each other as we died, then, we posed that much less of an apparent political threat. In early 1980, CBS ran a notorious documentary on how the gay rights movement was, going to threaten family values and all of this. A few years later, they ran a follow-up saying that the gay community had retreated inward and was basically, all of its members were either sick from AIDS or taking care of people who were sick from AIDS, and therefore it was a signal to straight America, you don't have to worry about these guys. And as the role of being a gay man was redefined in terms of sickness and caregiving, it did create a great deal of sympathy. For one thing, people realized, oh my God, these two people living together really love each other. Look at, what the one who's healthy is doing for the one who's dying. So, on the one hand, it made people a lot more sympathetic to us. On the other hand, it was a very limited kind of sympathy based on victimhood, on powerlessness. You don't have to worry about these people anymore. They're not going to be a threat. They're too busy taking care of each other to threaten you. So it was really a double-edged sword in that regard. I think there have been several phases in the way AIDS has redefined the gay community. First was the one we just discussed, where it moved us from active agents of our own liberation to victims, that we were seen as a community that had been hit by this disease, that we were seen as nobly taking care of each other. And the other transformation that it made is it also really trashed the whole idea of liberation through sexuality, that gays themselves became much more highly moralistic towards each other. And I think you see that today, even though AIDS is not the top concern of gay politics the way it used to be, you see that very much in things like the movement for same-sex marriage. That would have been inconceivable in the 1970s, the idea that marriage would be the mass demand of the movement. But it shifted from, a gay man is someone who realizes his potential and defines himself by having sex with as many people as he can consensually, in as many different settings, as many different ways, exploring himself through his sexuality, to a gay man is a man who partners with another man and builds a family values lifestyle, and thereby wants to preserve that family values lifestyle and have the relationship recognized the way straight people's relationships are recognized by being married. What benefits did AIDS bring to the gay community? First of all, it brought this kind of acceptance of victimhood, that people were going to look on us more nobly because we were doing such a great job taking care of each other, forming organizations, raising money, lobbying. Before AIDS, the demand of the gay community towards government had basically been to leave us alone. Afterwards, we started going to government and saying, we need money. And when the money was not forthcoming, we raised it ourselves. And I would say also that AIDS benefited the gay community in terms of finances, that it just brought a lot of money into the gay community. You had people like Elizabeth Taylor doing benefits for AIDS. You had this enormous infrastructure that's set up. And whereas the AIDS organizations started out as volunteer groups, with the money available, particularly from the government, once that started kicking in the late 80s, you had paid staff members, you had large buildings, you had multi-million-dollar budgets, you had all the indicia of financial success riding on this disease, and as a result you created a whole infrastructure within the gay community of people who are financially dependent on the continued existence of AIDS. The people in the organizations, the people running them, and also many of the patients themselves who are on Social Security disability have retired on the basis that they have this invariably fatal illness and they need to be taken care of, so they don't have to work. And it got even worse at the end of the 1980s when just testing HIV positive was defined as a disease in and of itself, a disease that you could get Social Security disability for even if you were otherwise perfectly healthy. Gay leadership, I think generally there were a handful of exceptions, but they generally wanted this to be a virus under the belief that it would be less likely that they would be blamed for it, that the gay lifestyle or homosexuality itself they feared would be blamed for it if it were linked to the kinds of toxic factors that the risk AIDS hypothesis discusses. And they would rather it be a virus, partly because it would seem to let them off the hook, and also because if it's a virus, then it's not going to stay in the gay community. It's going to threaten everybody. And if it threatens everybody, then there's a much greater chance of lobbying the government and getting funding for research, for patient care, for all the various services that are involved with AIDS, that this is not going to be something that many people care about if it's just killing off gay men and a few other groups that a lot of people consider socially undesirable. If it's a virus, then the gay leadership could go before Congress and the state legislatures and say, it's us now, it's you tomorrow, you need to spend money on this. It was a reluctance to re-examine people's own actions in terms of their use of poppers. I think more the resistance came from the fact that the popper manufacturers had become such an enormous economic powerhouse in the gay community that they were making enormous amounts of money themselves, manufacturing and selling poppers, and they were spending a lot of advertising money in the gay press and keeping the gay media in business. So obviously the poppers manufacturers had a vested interest in making sure their product was not blamed for AIDS. The gay media had a vested interest in making sure that poppers were not blamed for AIDS, and therefore the coverage in the gay media skewed away from poppers and other similar risk factors and towards the viral hypothesis. I would say the majority of what was defined originally as AIDS was due to toxic factors. People who were using recreational drugs, using or abusing pharmaceutical drugs, coming down with a lot of different infections that, one genuine risk of a multiple partner sexual lifestyle is you are going to be much more likely to encounter genuine sexually transmitted diseases. And in the 1970s, if you got an STD, you just nipped down to the public clinic and got antibiotics for it. And a lot of gay men would take so-called prophylactic shots of antibiotics before they were going to have a hot partying weekend, figuring, wrongly by the way, that if they had the antibiotic in their system and they encountered syphilis or gonorrhea or whatever, they wouldn't get it. But I would say that there is an original AIDS syndrome that is caused by exposure to toxic factors, and that this explains most of the original AIDS cases and most of the people, including members of the dissident movement, who are themselves still dying of AIDS symptoms, even if they haven't taken the anti-HIV medications, simply because at some previous point they weakened their bodies enough that even leading a healthy lifestyle in the future was not going to save them. The idea that AIDS was sexually transmitted came from people who wanted it to be an infectious hypothesis, who noticed that a lot of the people in the original patient groups actually knew each other. And now I would say, well, they knew each other because they were going to the same parties, they were part of the same scene, they had run into each other, they had socialized, they had befriended each other, maybe they'd had sex with each other. And so it was highly logical that people living the same kind of lifestyle and exposing themselves to the same toxicities would know each other. But what happened was very early on in the epidemiology, the people at the CDC started using the magic word cluster. They said, because these people know each other, therefore they constitute an epidemiological cluster, meaning a handful of people who are spreading an infectious agent one to the other. And because the way they knew each other were in sexually charged situations, they figured, okay, this must be sexually transmitted because that's how the cluster of people know each other. They come into contact with each other by going to places where they can have casual sex. Therefore, it must be a sexually transmitted infectious agent. And that was what I call the first false clue, the mistake that started all the other mistakes. It was a political proclamation of scientific truth. Robert Gallo successfully lobbied Margaret Heckler, who was then the Secretary of Health and Human Services, to proclaim his view of what caused AIDS to be absolute scientific truth. And she went on with him in tow and announced that. The conference was held before any of Robert Gallo's papers were published, Therefore, before any other scientist had a chance to review them and look at the evidence and see if he got it right or wrong. And it was also done right when Gallo had patented the HIV antibody test. So they made sure that his patent rights were protected first. Then they did the press conference. And then, before Gallo's papers appeared in print, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services decided from now on, we are only going to fund AIDS research that assumes that Robert Gallo's virus is the cause. We are not going to fund research into any other possibilities. Therefore, the scientists who might have wanted to critique Gallo's papers would not be able to do so, at least not with anything supported by the federal government, which is virtually all science in this country today. Gay men who were in the PR industry, as AIDS started to break, were kind of asking themselves, what can we do? This crisis threatens our community. How can we use our expertise to help? And they realized early on that as long as AIDS was seen as a disease just affecting gays and a few other marginal populations that not many people cared about, it was not going to get the kind of broad-based support that would be needed to get millions of dollars out of Congress to research it, to fund AIDS services, to fund patient care, to fund all these organizations. So they came up with the idea that everyone is at risk for AIDS, that this was what we had to, as a society, to tell our people. And in an article she did for Spin magazine around 1990, Celia Farber not only told the story about how this PR campaign was formulated, she even identified the person who first thought of it, a man named Terry Byrne, B-E-I-R-N-E, who was the founding PR director for the American Foundation for AIDS Research until he himself was diagnosed with AIDS. And he was the one who worked out this strategy, and it encompassed lobbying not only for money, but also for the federal government to make that kind of statement. And at the time, and still today in some circles, that pamphlet is considered this great, fabulous thing that we were able to get lobbied through against the opposition of the radical right and the Reagan administration, when it really was a part of a major PR campaign to sell AIDS as a disease that the American public, not just gay people and their friends, needed to be concerned about. On May 1st, 1996, the Wall Street Journal published an article that basically exposed the propaganda campaign that had been waged by gay professionals in the public relations industry to persuade the American people that AIDS was something that would affect everybody, and to persuade the American government to think of AIDS as something that would affect everybody. Now, these revelations had actually appeared before, particularly in Celia Farber's articles in Spin magazine, but the Wall Street Journal really pushed it to, obviously, a much wider audience, and basically made the statement, with which I thoroughly concur, that the government had been persuaded to spend an enormous amount of money on AIDS on the basis that it would affect everybody, and in the process probably not only spending more money than it needed to, but spending it in places that were highly unlikely to be affected and neglecting the gay communities and other places where the epidemic really was a serious health risk. So it's sort of like what we've seen more recently, where Republican politicians have lobbied for funds for the war on terrorism in really unlikely places. Why would Wyoming get more funding for anti-terrorism per capita than New York City, even though New York City not only has a lot of people, but was where the biggest hit on 9/11 occurred? Because the people in Wyoming had the clout and we're able to say terrorism affects everybody. And it was the same strategy that was done in the early 90s to persuade the government AIDS affects everybody, and therefore you should spend the money in what the Wall Street Journal said, and I agree, were really skewed ways. I would say that the Wall Street Journal article was a crack in the wall. It certainly didn't demolish the HIV/AIDS model or even alter that much many of the priorities of the federal government, but it did alert some people to the idea that there was another way of thinking about AIDS. And of course it was attacked in certain circles of the gay community as being homophobic, as saying, once again, there was that fear that if people lose the idea that everybody is at risk for AIDS, if it goes back to being something that people associate mostly with the gay community, we're going to lose all our funding, we're going to lose this tremendous amount of social support that we've gotten, and we're going to be essentially back to square one. So there was a lot of fear in the gay community, particularly in the upper leadership when that article came out for that reason.
Some people are very fortunate that they don't have these side effects. But many continue. So